Hello, I'm Judy Olian, and welcome to The Way Forward here at Quinnipiac University. I'm delighted to welcome our two guests to focus on the marketing of pharmaceutical products, the R&D process, the development of drugs, and how we think about the return on investments in the pharmaceutical industry. We have two fantastic guests here today and a wonderful moderator from Quinnipiac. I'll very briefly introduce them, and you can see their backgrounds in further detail on the website. Steve Sorrells is our guest from Pfizer, just recently departed from Pfizer, where he was VP of sales and had a variety of experiences over his 20 years at Pfizer across diverse geographies and various therapeutic areas. He worked internationally, not just in the United States, Asia, Europe, and Latin America, and has worked in vaccines, oncology, pain and cardiovascular disease. And most recently, he was helping lead a global team on how to transform the way Pfizer engages customers and patients throughout the healthcare system. He'll tell you a little bit about where he's moving to an interesting role as a COO of a healthcare technology company. Mike Benkowitz is president and COO of United Therapeutics. United Therapeutics is an orphan drug company that you'll hear about that was founded in 1996. Mike joined in 2011 after a career as a consultant and a compensation consultant, human resource consultant in the field and got to know United Therapeutics that way. He oversees a lot of functions at United Therapeutics, including human resources, information technology, real estate, risk management, sales, and many aspects of the collaborations across the commercial and medical affairs of the company. Mary Schramm is our own professor of marketing, associate professor of marketing at Quinnipiac with expertise in medical marketing. She'll be co-moderating this panel. She has had a lot of experience in the pharmaceutical field. Her areas of interest academically include new product development, legal and regulatory issues, and marketing strategy, where she's published quite a lot of research in that area. She previously worked in the pharmaceutical sales area, so she's highly equipped to moderate or co-moderate this session. So I'll start off and we'll switch back and forth. And I want to make sure that anyone who has any questions simply enters the question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So the healthcare sector is in many ways the most consequential part of the US economy, even before COVID. It's central to people's well-being, to their lives, with huge economic and budgetary implications, and well over 20% of all government spending is in healthcare. And the pharmaceutical industry sits squarely in the center of the healthcare sector, which is why today we're focused on that industry. So I want to first start with Steve and then Mike, so that each of you describes the scale and portfolio of your respective companies. Pfizer has a 210 billion market cap. It's a huge portfolio of healthcare and pharmaceutical products. And United Therapeutics, and I'll say UTHR for short, is a streamlined benefit corporation still run by its founder with a market cap of over $9 billion today, focused on orphan drugs. So Steve, why don't you start and tell us about that?
Sure, thank you, Judy. Thanks for the opportunity to be with everybody today. I hope everyone is well. My former employer, Pfizer, and companies like Pfizer, companies like Merck, for example, have over $40 billion in revenue on an annual basis. And a key is that these companies diversify themselves and have expertise in a very wide variety of therapeutic areas. For example, everything from oncology to cardiology to women's health to rare and orphan diseases like Mike will speak about, but also, as we've all become aware during COVID, also vaccines as well. And it's this diversity of focus and also this scale of revenue and resources that also really facilitates the ability for companies like Pfizer or Merck or many others to be able to invest in research and development to also a very large degree. Recently, companies like Merck and Pfizer invest up to $10 billion a year or more in looking for the next medicines to be able to tackle some of the dreaded diseases that we don't have answers for at this time. So a lot of companies of various sizes do amazing good for patients. Large-scale companies, like I mentioned, are just able to do so in many different therapeutic areas. And as a result of their scale, they're able to also invest significantly to be able to find, those next cures or vaccines for different diseases.
Mike?
Thanks, Judy. And I want to echo Steve's thanks and appreciation for the opportunity to be with you guys today and visit with the students. So UT is really, I guess, on the opposite end of that spectrum. And let me just kind of maybe back up and talk a little bit about how the company was started. It was really sort of started as a labor of love from our founder and still chairman and CEO Martine Rothblatt. Her daughter, when she was 7 years old, was diagnosed with a disease called pulmonary arterial hypertension, which is really a constriction of the blood vessels in the lungs, and it eventually leads to right heart failure and death if not treated and managed. There is no cure for the disease save for getting a lung transplant. So back in the 1990s, when Martine's daughter was diagnosed with this disease, she really kind of changed her mission in life, she and her partner, and that was really to try and find a therapy to treat her daughter and eventually a cure. And what you may not know about Martine is she was one of the founders of Sirius, the satellite company. So she kind of pushed that to the side and said, "This is my new focus on life." She was able to acquire our first drug from Burroughs Wellcome at the time and start United Therapeutics and take that through the development process and get that approved. And that was sort of the first version of our drug. So unlike companies like Merck and Pfizer that are big, what I would call kind of big pharma, and working in a lot of different areas, we have all along been and consciously been very focused on the disease areas and the patients we want to serve. And so Judy, you talked about in the introduction about our focus on orphan diseases, and that's absolutely true. And it even gets a little bit narrower than that, in that we're really kind of focused on cardiopulmonary diseases. And so we believe as a smaller company with about $1.5 billion in revenue compared to the $40 billion in revenue, our best way to be successful is to focus on our core competencies, the things that we know really well, and look for opportunities to develop medicines, develop devices, develop biologics to serve those unmet medical needs in the areas that we believe we know really well.
Well, thank you. And in being fully transparent, I also serve on the board of United Therapeutics. You both took very different paths in getting into your roles today. And it would be very instructive, especially for our students, to find out how you ended up in the roles that you occupy today. And so, Mike, take us briefly through your life story.
Sure. Yeah, I think my sort of career trajectory I would sort of characterize as a series of fortunate accidents, and I think evidence that there is no sort of straight line to your career. So I went to undergraduate school, to get a business degree, thought I was going to go into the business world. I got to about my junior year there. I said, no, I want to go be a lawyer. So decided to, I graduated from undergrad and went to law school. I got about halfway through law school and I'm like, well, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. So I don't really want to be a lawyer. Finished law school, went back the business route, went back into the business side of things. And as you mentioned, started a job as a human resources consultant, advising boards of directors on how to compensate, incentivize, motivate their executive teams. And thought I might do that for a couple of years and then go do something else. Well, fast forward 15 years, I did that. I started my own firm. Got to know United Therapeutics because they were a client of mine. So got to know the board, got to know the management team, and then back in 2011, came out for a board meeting, and Martine asked me to join the company as an employee. And so I joined at that time as I think the title was Executive Vice President of Organizational Development. I think the best way to think about that is really as a Chief Administrative Officer role. So I had as you talked about, human resources, IT, corporate real estate, as I like to say, all of the functions that nobody else wanted to deal with. I did that for about 5 years. And then 5 years ago, our president and chief operating officer, two individuals at the time, resigned on the same day. And so Martine asked me to take on this president and COO role. And so I've been doing that for the last 5 years and, drinking out of a fire hose, trying to learn all the additional functions that I assumed at that time.
Thank you. I do remember that day that you took on that role. Steve, tell us how you evolved into your professional career, and I think that is the only employer you've ever had.
Yeah, no, thank you, Judy. I love hearing Mike's story. It's so impressive for someone who's been an attorney in HR to be in the position he's at today. Mine's very different. I literally went to undergraduate, played a sport there. Right upon graduation, I started with Pfizer literally my first month out of college. It started as an entry-level salesperson, which was an entry port for a lot of colleagues in pharmaceuticals, especially in the early 2000s, late 90s, whenever I started with the company. From there, had a couple of different roles as a sales professional. From there, became a management trainee, got a chance to learn from great leaders how to lead organizations in an operations capacity. From there, I became a sales manager, so I had 10 to 12 direct reports. And then also went back and got my MBA on weekends because I wanted to have a broader perspective on what really drives a business. Upon graduating from my MBA, I left Texas and moved up to Pfizer's headquarters and had a role sort of as what they call director of operations, really someone who's just trying to help put the glue of an organization together. Every day was very different, but it gave me exposure to the breadth of what it takes that Michael lives every day to really run a company. Everything from research to marketing to manufacturing. And I got exposed to outstanding leaders as well. And it was a role that was global in capacity. So I got the chance to really see how the different regulatory and archetypes of healthcare markets work throughout the globe. From there, got the opportunity to lead the launch of a oncology brand in a certain region of the country. So I got exposure to marketing and oncology. After that, I got the opportunity to actually work and live in Indonesia to help lead that organization. And that was a fascinating time in my career where I learned not only a completely different business environment, but also a completely different cultural environment as well. And I had my family there for that time. Got a chance to move back to the U.S., had broader commercial responsibilities in both sales and marketing. From there, I've had responsibilities for market access, which is pricing type work, contracting type work. I've also had the opportunity to lead one of our brands. So that's a marketing role in the pharmaceutical industry. So one of our brands and leading the promotional efforts for that brand. And then I also had the ability to be a sales lead in the U.S. for Pfizer And then before I recently left the company, as Judy mentioned, I got the opportunity to work with a cross-functional team, really looking at how are we going to take our amazing products and be able, in a new era, as things continue to transform in the marketplace, really be able to communicate the value of our medicines to both physicians as well as to patients. Before my recent transition, as Judy mentioned, to take on a little bit more different role of a chief operating officer as on a very much smaller entrepreneurial type healthcare innovation company that'll be focused on more on technology as opposed to purely the pharmaceutical space. So it's been a journey, very different to Michael's, but a lot of different functional responsibility as well.
So just flipping it over to our co-moderator, Mary, I do want to encourage everyone to put their questions in the chat, in the Q&A box. And I promise you we will get to them as we go. We'll fold those in. So Mary, please.
Well, thank you. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about research and development. So Michael, we've seen that innovative new drug therapies can literally cure disease and profoundly impact people's lives for the better. But these therapies are not developed overnight. Could you talk a little bit about the lengthy timeline for developing new drugs? For example, why does it take so long, and what are the major milestones in that timeline?
Sure. It is a lengthy process, and I think for specific companies, how long that takes sometimes, a lot of times depends on where they're entering or where they're taking over in that process. But if you think about from start to finish, so drug discovery all the way through FDA approval, generally speaking, that's about a decade-long process. And I was looking at some data, the other day from the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturing Association, which is one of our industry trade groups, that shows that, on average, if you factor in all of the failures, that process on average is about $2.5 to $3 billion, which is just really a mind-blowing amount of money over a long period of time. And so it's a lot of work, particularly that front end, is trying to identify what are those molecules? How do you formulate them in a way that we think can be effective? Not only effective though, but safety is a big part of that process too. So it's one thing to say, okay, the drug's going to work, it's going to treat the disease, it's going to cure the disease, but if it's not safe for the individual, you don't really have anything there that you can take to market. So that's sort of that drug discovery, trying to kind of select and target it, find a molecule, target a disease, that's sort of an early process. And then you're getting into the clinical development process. And there that in and of itself is about a 6 to 7 year period of time, generally speaking. So you have what's typically called a phase 1 study, which is you're testing the drug for safety, as I talked about, and in a small group of human subjects. Once you clear that process, you're moving into what's called a phase 2 study, which is now you're looking at both safety and efficacy in a little bit larger group of patients than the phase 1, but still, not a huge group of patients. And then if that works out, you move into what's called a phase 3 or the pivotal study. So these are the major studies, big, large R&D studies that many of us are probably familiar with, where you're testing for efficacy and safety in hundreds, if not thousands, of patients. And so all along the way, that process takes time. You're having to develop protocols. You're having to engage with the FDA to get them to sign off on the protocols. You're having to recruit sites either in country or across the world to participate. They have a whole contracting process that can sometimes take 6 months to a year. Then you're having to recruit subjects. You're having to get them enrolled. You're having to follow them for a period of time. Then you're having to analyze the data and make decisions, from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. So it's just a very long, methodical process, and takes as I said, can take up to 10 years from start to finish.
Wow, thank you for that detail. You mentioned the average cost to develop a new drug. From a business standpoint, how do you calculate the return on investment or the ROI on those efforts?
Yeah, I think when you're going into that process, and like I said, I think companies enter into that process in different ways. So a lot of times, like a company like us, or I would, and I'm curious to hear what Steve said. I think this is probably true of Pfizer, is they may not be starting at the very beginning and taking it all the way through. They may acquire the asset at some point along the way and pick it up and take it through the development process. But really, what you're looking at is, what's the cost to acquire the asset? What do we think the cost is to run the trial? You're looking at the market size, the potential patient population. You're trying to understand what the reimbursement or the pricing landscape looks like, and then you're trying to model that out and make sure that there's a good economic rationale for making this large scale investment. All the while having to factor in the fact that there's risk, right? It may not work. At phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, you may have an unsuccessful trial, so you have to sort of calculate that risk in your analysis.
Thank you. So Stephen, following up on the risk and mentioning that risk results in many drugs never making it to market, lots of failures. Can one successful blockbuster drug cover the losses that the company incurs from the unsuccessful drugs that never get to market?
Yeah, it can. Mary, maybe to build a little bit on Mike's point, I think there's a couple different ways, we try to look at ROI in our industry. One is you look at it from the company's perspective, but also you try to look at it from the marketplace's perspective as well. And I think we're seeing more and more different technological evaluations that third parties or actual payers will make on a given product to be able to say, is this product, quote unquote, cost effective? So for the outlay of costs that are paid, what is the outcome that healthcare entity or that patient will receive? For example, does it reduce length of stay in a hospital? Does it reduce morbidity, mortality? Because all those things require resources and also, of course, critical human lives that are impacted as well. So from an ROI perspective, really building on, Mike, I think summarized it incredibly efficiently and well. There's also that marketplace evaluation that happens. And so what we try to look at is to say, what's our evaluation on that return, but also how would objective third parties on the other side evaluate that as well? And sure, given the success of some products that are on the marketplace in terms of the amount of patients they're able to impact and the associated revenues, yes, there are products that can more than make up for the R&D costs. Otherwise, that price of innovation would be too high if that risk didn't have a reward to it. But to Mike's point, when you look at the statistics, there are many more than there are quote unquote successes. And that's just a balance of the risk reward in this type of business.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think Steve makes a great point about the outcomes based nature of this. I think that is something we've seen, I think, rise to the forefront in the last few years, and I think it's only become more pronounced and more important as we move forward. And that really, I think, ties into reimbursement and pricing. So the value proposition of what you're providing to the market, and that can certainly, if you have a good value proposition, if you have good outcomes, as Steve says, if you're able to reduce hospitalizations or other types of healthcare related costs by virtue of a patient taking your medicine, that certainly helps the company. It also helps the healthcare ecosystem and obviously the patient.
I can attest to the fact that there is so much risk and uncertainty associated with the R&D process, because I've witnessed that excitement and tension in the air when a pharmaceutical company is unblinding a clinical trial result and really not knowing, did it work or did it not work? And it could be that on that moment of unblinding, you're either burying and losing tens or hundreds of millions of dollars worth invested in the clinical trials to that point, or on the contrary, you may be ready to reap an incredible result for patients, for healthcare, and also for the bottom line. And we will go to some questions, I think, as soon as Mary maybe asks one more question.
Sure. So just following up on the investment, an important part of the return on investment is patenting the drug. And so, Michael and Stephen, both, if you could give us just a brief overview of the patent approval process, including factors that are unique to the pharmaceutical industry, such as exclusivity, to help protect that investment for as long as possible.
Sure. Steve, you want to go first? You want me to go first?
And Mike, I'll start, and then you can round us out. First, maybe just to give a little bit of definitions, because some of these things, if you're in the industry, you may take for granted, but just to level set the playing field a bit. There are really kind of two pivotal terms. One, a patent, and then two, exclusivity, as Mary cited. And they both work in a very similar fashion, but they're distinct from one another. And they're actually governed by different statutes. So a patent is actually a property right that's granted by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And it can be granted anytime during the development of a drug. And these patents typically last around 20 years, as opposed to FDA's exclusivity refers to any sort of delays or blocks from a generic version of that product that was approved from being able to be produced or also approved during that given exclusivity period. And exclusivity typically starts upon the FDA's approval, and it's really been designed to balance the ability to have new drugs that are innovative and have incentives for that innovation through this exclusivity, but also the ability for generics to be able to come into the market after a given period of time as well. And the length of time on exclusivity is really based upon the type of approval. And even the first authorized generic has exclusivity for a period of time as well. So hopefully, Mary, that gives a little bit of context in terms of the differences between really two key terms. And Mike, I'll welcome you to add some context in regards to the process as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent summary. And I guess, Mary, to your point about the importance of patents and exclusivity in the pharmaceutical industry, it's incredibly important. I think without both of those things, there's no incentive for companies to take 10 years and spend $2.5 billion developing drugs, right? On the back end, there has to be a payoff. And so those two things work very nicely in terms of allowing the company, if they're fortunate enough to gain approval, to have an opportunity to then market the drug and have really kind of a free and clear path to recoup some of that money before you have, as Steve said, you have generics come in down the line.
Thank you.
And let me pick up on one of the audience questions related to that. And I might ask Steve and Mike, as tempting as it is to let you answer lengthily, there are quite a few questions we want to get to in a limited time. So maybe in deference to all of the questions coming in, we'll shorten it. So Jay Brogy asks, and I mispronounced the name, I'm sure, because of the substantial investments in pharmaceutical compounds or drugs, should drug companies be allowed to have longer patent rights for certain compounds to recoup their investment? The patent rights are typically, is it 17 years in the pharma space?
They're typically about 20 years, but they start from the date you file the patent, and so that could be early on in the R&D process. Mm-hmm. So by the time you get to approval, you may only have a few years or some number of years left on that patent. That's where the exclusivity comes in as incredibly important, because if the patent has expired by the time you get it approved, again, you want to have those incentives for the innovator or the manufacturer to recoup those funds. So that's how those two things work together.
And you think the length of time is about right? I mean, of course, for United Therapeutics drugs, you'd like it forever.
I'd like it to be forever, but it's probably, if I take off my company hat and think about it from a citizen and as a participant in the healthcare ecosystem, it's probably about right.
And Mike, maybe to add to that, I wish I could recall the exact statistic, But I think one of the things that is so incredible about the healthcare system we do have is we do have a period of time where that innovation can be rewarded, but also through the generic process, there's a period of time where that intellectual property, that in many cases life-saving medication, is available for literally pennies for humanity to be able to benefit from, both in the U.S. and outside the U.S. So, the exact period of time, I don't know what that should be, but I do know the process we have allows for both incentive, but also the ability for that technology to benefit many people in a very economical way over time.
Yeah, and I'm going to add to that. Sorry, Judy, we're not really sticking to your answer quick. But I think the other thing that the generic process does is it actually it's part of the circle of encouraging innovation, right? So we as a company are developing novel therapeutics. As our drugs have gone generic, we've made significant investments in trying to build a better mousetrap. So how do we take our existing devices, our existing drugs, make them better, and then get new patent protection? And so that helps us as a company, but it results in a better outcome for the patients because they have a better drug or a better device to benefit from our medicines.
Yeah, and I won't spend time on this, but what Mike said is very important, that you can patent and have exclusivity not just about a drug, but for example, the delivery mechanism. Is it subcutaneous? Does it have a release device that is unique to that drug, and so forth? So there are multiple ways in which you can obtain a patent or exclusivity. There are a couple of questions that take us to the question of direct marketing to consumers. And anytime you watch a show, especially one of the shows that are oriented towards, how should one say, the older demographic, you almost only see pharmaceutical drugs marketed. And I think most companies ban direct pharmaceutical to consumer marketing, except US and New Zealand, maybe.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And so the question is, are consumers really best positioned and educated to make decisions about drug choices for themselves, for their own complex disease? Is it an effective mechanism, and is it an ethical process to direct market to consumers for drugs, and potentially for drugs for complex diseases like cancers? Okay, Steve, take that.
Yeah, happy to. It's a great question. There are very strict controls and review processes to make sure that the information that is provided directly to consumers is medically accurate and fully in line with the approved use for a given product. And to me, accurate information in the hands of consumers is a good thing, especially in the context of the ultimate decision maker in pharmaceuticals and which patient gets what medicine is made by the healthcare provider. And from my perspective, these providers are amongst the most highly trained and educated professionals in the world. I mean, if you think about 4 years of college, 4 years of med school, residency, fellowships, these are highly trained individuals that ultimately have the final say in what medicine a patient receives. So from my point of view, having worked with many physicians, they're going to ultimately do what's best for that patient. And hopefully this sort of education that's provided in the form of these commercials, whether they be on social media or they're on television, it's creating a dialogue between the patient and their provider so they can make a shared decision, so that the provider is doing what's best for the patient given their license, and also the patient feels ownership in their health care as well, because ultimately they need to adhere to that medication and then hopefully have the targeted healthcare outcome. So that'd be my perspective, Judy, on a very, I know, highly debated topic.
Mike, do you want to weigh in on this?
I agree with everything Steve just said. There you go. There's your short answer.
So further to marketing, are we seeing now, in part because of cultural societal awareness, more multicultural awareness in drug marketing, especially now given the consciousness about bringing the COVID vaccine to all segments of our population. So are we seeing more of that now, greater awareness?
Mike, I'll jump in. I hope so, Judy. I think at the end of the day, diseases, cancers, etc., they don't know color, they don't know bounds. And so I know I can speak for myself as a person in the healthcare landscape that wants to make sure all patients that can benefit from our medicines are able to do so. And so I think what we will see with greater consciousness, that's appropriate now, that we educate for all patients and make sure everyone feel included in the healthcare ecosystem. So I do hope, and I have seen a greater, more broad awareness and engagement across cultural barriers to make sure that the right education is in the right hands of the right patient.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we're seeing that. I think we will continue to see that. I know for our part as a company, it's something that's top of mind for us and something that we have. I think we've done an adequate job of over the years, but certainly in light of what we've seen in our country over the last year and a half, is something that we're certainly prioritizing with our efforts.
Let me go to another question that has come up also in the context of some students and others who are asking about the international landscape for pharmaceuticals. So the first question I'd ask on that is about drug pricing. And there's been a lot of attention to drug pricing and criticism sometimes of companies about drug prices. A RAND study from this year showed compared drug prices across 32 countries, and that the US prices are 2.5 times higher than those in the average of the other countries. Help us understand the dynamics, and it may go back to the whole question that Mary asked earlier about the price of developing drugs. Do you want to take that, Mike, and then we'll go to Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk a little bit. I think Steve's got much more international experience than I do on this, so I can talk about it, at sort of a high level. I think in the U.S., yes, I think what's driving that is it's the healthcare system we have, the payer system we have. There are more payers. There's a little bit more competition, and there's the cost associated with developing the drugs and what the market will bear. When you get outside of the U.S., in most cases, you're talking about single payer healthcare systems, and they hold all the power, and they can really drive down the price and push down the price, and a lot of them do that. Most of them do that, and so I think that really to me explains a lot of the big differences between what you see in the U.S. and what you see in some of the ex-U.S. countries. But again, maybe let Steve comment on this, because I think he's got much more experience on that than I do.
Mike, listen, I can only build on. You made a great point. What I'd like to start with is, a lot of times this question is anchored in an individual's not able to afford their medication, whether that's you or a loved one. And what I'd always encourage people is, if you're having trouble in those regards, go to company websites. The overwhelming majority of research-based pharmaceutical companies have outstanding access and support programs to make sure that those patients that have been prescribed a medication have help and support to be able to obtain it. So I'd absolutely recommend for your loved ones, if that's ever a challenge, to leverage those resources that are available. I think Mike touched on very well, having lived and worked in both the U.S. and outside the U.S., there are pros and cons to every health system. No one is perfect. And I think Mike hit on the key point. When you have single payer systems, that affords them the ability to really be able to have a lot of negotiating power in terms of not only the price they pay, but if they'll reimburse a product at all. And that also can sometimes limit the amount of therapeutic choice that's available in a given area also. And also in the U.S., our healthcare system is very unique, with an ecosystem that includes insurers, pharmacy benefit managers, because, you know, a pharma manufacturer may give a certain discount to be able to have a certain formulary status with a payer or a PBM. And that discount can be significant. But ultimately, when I show up to the pharmacy, my out-of-pocket cost may not reflect that discount. And all of that cost may not be because of, quote unquote, the manufacturer. It may be based on the discount system. Part of that is going to the insurer or to the pharmacy benefit manager. And I share that not to point fingers, but just to share that there are many stakeholders in the U.S. Ecosystem for pricing. And oftentimes the list price and the net price are very different. So it is a very complicated system, but I have seen progress. When you look in recent years at manufacturers' price increases, they're oftentimes much more in line with inflation than they have been in years past, especially when you look at the net price increase, when you take into account the discounts that I mentioned as well.
Mary, you're on mute.
I am, thank you. So Stephen, for many of the reasons you've mentioned, the public has been critical of the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm wondering if you think that the public's view of the industry will change in response to the role some companies have played, including Pfizer, in bringing COVID-19 vaccines to the market in record time.
Yeah, you know, Mary, I just read this weekend a report in Becker's Hospital Review that basically said from a survey this January, over 60% of people had a positive opinion of pharmaceutical companies. And this was up 30% from the prior year.
Wow.
And I do believe companies like Moderna, J&J, Pfizer, et cetera, that have really doubled down their efforts to be able to help during a pandemic has just brought to life a lot of the great work like companies like United Therapeutics and many others have been doing for years. Mm-hmm. What I can say, companies are made up of people, and I can attest that the type of people I've had the pleasure to work with both in my former employer, Pfizer, or in other partnerships at other companies that I've worked for, you know, people are really focused on bringing life-saving medicine. That's why they chose this profession over others. And I hope COVID has helped to shine a light on the good work that pharmaceutical companies are trying to do for society.
Thank you. And Michael, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I share Steve's view on that, and I think by and large again, I'm a participant in the industry, so I'm a little biased, but I think I think we get a bad rap in generalities. I mean, there certainly have been some bad actors over the years that have you know, kind of, we've all been sort of tarred with that, but I think by and large, to Steve's point, it's an industry made up of really good people that are trying to help people that are sick. And we're all trying to I think the vast majority of us are trying to do the right things. I think Steve's point that he made on the last question about some of the things that companies try and do to make their medicines available to patients that either don't have insurance or you know, can't afford their copay amounts it's fairly widespread. It's not one or two companies. It's the vast majority of companies do this. So I think there's a lot of things that as an industry we do really, really well. Like I said, there's a few bad actors, and yeah, I hope that through COVID and the continued advancements that we make for patients that opinion continues to improve.
Thank you.
You know, I want to pick up on the whole COVID impact on the industry. So there's a question here from Gabriel about both the accelerated speed of discovery as well as the accelerated speed of approval of COVID drugs. To what extent, I mean, given the 10-year timeline that's typical, this was beyond miraculous. To what extent do you think that this is going to generalize and become more embedded in what the normal state of operations of the business, or is this still just a one-off? Can we generalize to the way drug discovery might happen in the future.
I hope it leads. I mean, look, if you think about the role of the FDA, who approves drugs, their role is to make sure that the drug works and that it's safe for patients, right? That's really fundamentally what they're after. I think if there are opportunities to accelerate that process, still while still achieving those goals, I think that would be a great thing. I think that's going to take some regulatory intervention or congressional intervention for that to happen. If you think about the path that the vaccines went through to get this speedy approval, they did it under what's called an emergency use authorization, which is it's a special path that was put in place after the September 11th, 2001 attacks to accelerate the rate at which medicines could be brought to the market in situations like COVID, where you have a global pandemic or public health issue on this type of scale. And so, what happens is you're still doing good science, you're still doing clinical trials. I would say the burden of proof or the scrutiny that the FDA puts on the filing is it's just at a little bit lower standard. So where typically what they're looking for is substantial evidence that the drug works and is safe. In the EUA approach, they're looking at whether the drug is reasonably likely to have an effect. And so, that does allow you to accelerate your process, submit with, I wouldn't say incomplete data, but not as robust a data set as you might normally submit under a typical approval path. Having said all that, if you look at what the FDA put in place for COVID specifically, and Steve may be able to talk about this maybe a little bit more if he feels comfortable, I still think the FDA took a pretty critical view of the data that was my understanding of the data that was submitted by Pfizer, by Moderna, by J&J because of what was at stake. But it was sort of this separate path that these drugs were approved. Now, coming back at the end of the pandemic, all of these companies are going to have to come back and do sort of your typical FDA filing and provide all of the data that you would normally provide in order to get a full approval.
So as a follow-up, Mike, do you think that U.S. politics come into play with the FDA approval process? Is one political party more favorable to the industry than another?
I hope it doesn't come into play in terms of FDA approval. I mean, certainly, I think in this situation with COVID, I think there was political pressure, right? And a lot of people wanted to see things move through. So maybe I'm contradicting myself there, but I think generally speaking, I don't see that. We don't see that in our company, that there's political pressure on the FDA approval process. I think in terms of does one political party benefit pharma more than the other? It's hard to say. I think if you go back a few years, you might say that, okay, maybe the Republicans generally viewed as being more pro-business might be more favorable to pharmaceutical versus the Democrats. Interestingly, I think it seems like the one thing that both parties can agree on is that they think drug prices are too high. And so I think, there does seem to be a lot of energy and a lot of agreement there. Now, how you address that, we're back to, I think everybody in their corners and arguing about that. But I think conceptually, I think both parties believe that drug prices are too high. And so I think we're all, I think, expecting and prepared that there's going to be something, over the, whether it's 2, 3, 5 years, that comes through Congress to get at that.
Thank you.
Steve, maybe this is just a follow-up before we get into career questions that some of our folks have asked. One of the other interesting facets of the COVID vaccination process has been unusual partnerships. I mean, who would have thought that J&J and Merck would have gone into a production agreement, or Pfizer with the German firm, and collaboration, I think, a lot with the FDA and CDC. I mean, the nature of collaboration was very different than the hyper-competitive environment of before. Is this something that's going to stick?
Yeah, I think, Judy, it just exposed what I had seen was a more collaborative environment between companies that was already becoming more and more the norm. So what I mean by this is, if you look at some of the top products or molecules today, many in development, many that are in the market, they're co-developed or co-promoted by two different companies. And they do this for a wide variety of reasons. One, given the research and development cost Mike cited earlier and the low probability of success, two companies coming together can share that risk. Also, when two companies together, they can share capabilities as well. So you may have one company that's much smaller that may partner up with a much larger company because of their manufacturing footprint, because of their commercial, sales, and marketing capabilities and footprint. So I think in large part, this was already becoming more and more of the norm. But I think this has been a special time where you really see the good faith that the companies have put together to say, how do we meet this global pandemic and how do we leverage capabilities? But I think it also just accentuates what was already starting to go on more and more in the industry as well.
So let me pivot to ask a couple of career questions. And students have been asking this. You all have some different facets in your backgrounds. I mean, Steve, you were a football player in college. You have an MBA. You had an international business career through Pfizer. What do you think the most important characteristics or background features have shaped your career? And to what extent can you advise students around that?
Yeah, I'll start. I think, for me, sports was a major influence in who I am as a person and who I am as a leader. When I think about college students, though, sports is one example, but I think the bigger issue for me was balancing the demands of academics and athletics. That could be balancing the demands of a part-time job in academics, balancing the demands of club engagement, balancing the demands of different student activities. That can happen. But for me, being able to balance academics and athletics was very important for me and are skills that I carry to this day. And also for me, leadership principles, whether it was a great coach, I still have a professor from college that I'm very close with, or my mother. And, when I look at some of these leaders, they really had a posture of service and led in a way that they got genuine satisfaction in seeing others succeed. And so, I think that's something that, whether it was a teacher, a coach, or early mentors, that's made a big footprint or imprint rather in my leadership style over the course of my career as well.
What do you look for when you hire younger people coming into Pfizer?
Yeah,
I'll ask Mike the same question.
Yeah, so for me, there are really kind of three characteristics that transcend any specific technical need that may be, whether it be marketing or finance or sales or what have you. And those three for me over the years have been first, excellence. Being able to demonstrate, whether it's academically, of course, but also their ability to balance that with what I mentioned, club activities, sports, a part-time job, ability to show prioritization and time management that really delivers great results. Second for me is leadership. Again, it can be in a wide variety of ways, but can you inspire followership from others? And are you someone that people want to work with and collaborate with? Because so much of what we all do today has to be done in teams. And then I think the third one for me that I always try to keep top of mind is what I call just relentlessness. Just that ability to overcome obstacles. No matter what the job is, you're going to have challenges and barriers, and we need people who can overcome them. And so the ability to show a track record of, no matter what type of obstacle you may have run into, how you're able to work to overcome it. So those are some of the transcendent characteristics, Judy, that I've typically looked for.
Mike, how do you hire?
Yeah, I think it's similar. I might spin it maybe a little bit different. I mean, the things I'm looking for when I'm hiring are intelligence, right? And not just book smarts, but just general like intelligence. I think is really important to me. I like the relentlessness piece. That's certainly something that I find to be incredibly important. I mean, there's a saying that we use here internally that, I don't know who originated the quote, but it's, the saying is if plan A fails, stay cool. There's 25 other letters in the alphabet, right? So it's just, being able to sort of, okay, you're going to have challenges and adversity thrown in front of you at work and life, and just how are you able to respond to that and find a different way forward. So I think that's really important. And then I think the third piece, particularly at our company, is this idea of initiative. I think we sort of fashion ourselves as being a well-funded grown-up startup company. We love the fact that we have this entrepreneurial vibe that's made us successful, and in my operations role, one of the things I'm trying to do is sort of kind of keep that, bottle that up and be able to retain that as we get bigger and bigger. And I think a lot of that is, having employees that have initiative to not just do what they're told, but really kind of, on their own, look for ways to solve a problem or look for ways to develop a product or whatever it is.
So in the last 2 minutes, Mary has the last question.
Yes, so very quickly, Michael and then Stephen will be interested in your thoughts on this too. And this question actually comes from Jane Young, one of the members of the audience. And she's wondering if you anticipate major changes and how individuals are going to manage their own healthcare in the next 5 to 10 years, really enabled by technology tools like AI. And if so, how will it affect pharma?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start on this. I think it will, and we touched on this a little bit when we were talking about the question around the direct to consumer to market. I think what's absolutely true is that individuals are taking on greater ownership for their healthcare. Now, obviously, they're going to consult with their physicians as they should. They are the experts in the field. But I think that's also part of what's led to, I think, what you see in terms of more patient-centric marketing and sharing of information and as Steve said, medically accurate information. So I think, as technology evolves, as AI becomes more prominent, I think that's just going to accelerate, and individuals are going to have more information, more tools at their disposal to understand whatever they're afflicted with, understand what the treatment options are, and then have I think a really educated dialogue with the physician, which is, as we talked about before, is really what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to get the right information to the right constituents so that they can have a discussion about the best way to treat the individual's disease.
Okay, thank you. And last word from Stephen.
Just ditto. I think, the only point I'll punctuate is, even with clinical trials, with things like artificial intelligence, we'll be able to quantify and evaluate data in much more rapid ways that only can potentially bring more medicines to patients that need them in a more expedited way.
So that it not only affects the relationship with the consumer, but also the production and supply chain cycles, etc.
For sure.
In a huge way. Well, we've run out of time, definitely not out of questions, but we want to thank you both for providing such a large scan of the industry, of all of the players. It's an incredibly complicated and important piece, not just of everyone's well-being, but of the economy as a whole and the global economy. So thank you for your roles, and thank you, Mary,
You're welcome.
for being part of this and for being part of our teaching programs, because I know many students are interested in this. So be well, everyone, and thanks for being part of the way forward.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Bye.